chapter 1, verse 21. I call God as my witness that it was in order to spare you that I did not return to Corinth. Excuse me, that's 23. As you can see, my eyes are getting rather old and the print is small. It happens to all of us, as is well recorded in the book of Ecclesiastes in the last chapter thereof. So here is Paul. And Paul has been discussing for several paragraphs here why he did not show up in Corinth at the time he spoke. Now, is this the travel plans that he talks about in 1 Corinthians? Or is this a later trip? It is quite interesting to try to figure this out. Was there a visit in the period recorded in the book of Acts that simply isn't listed in the book of Acts? I mean, after all, the book of Acts does not have an absolute day-by-day accounting of all of Paul's time. All interesting speculation. But we can only go with what we have, which is that Paul laid out some plans to go to Corinth and then to Macedonia and then back through Corinth, which happens to be identical to what he describes in 1 Corinthians. It's also a very convenient trip because of the location of Corinth, where it was located. If you wanted to go to Macedonia, it was very likely that you would go through Corinth to get there every time you went, but not necessarily always. So he's trying to explain this because people are getting so upset, and using this as an argument that he says one thing and does something else, and that this impugns his character so badly. So he says, I call God as my witness that it was in order to spare you that I did not return to Corinth. Now, he says, as God is my witness. Now, if you go back a couple of lessons, which I think there'll be a banner above my head here that you can click on, you can go to this lesson on 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, God is my witness, and it will deal with this question of whether we should say, God is my witness about something or not, and that issue. But we'll move on to this question. It was in order to spare you. Spare you of what? Well, we can see that the church in Corinth had some serious problems. And in 1 Corinthians, he outlines a procedure, which some people down here call churching. The people I was first trained with called disfellowship. Neither term is in the Bible, but it describes a biblical procedure that even Jesus made reference to that says, if someone is sinning blatantly and will not stop, we don't keep coddling him in the church. We exclude him. Now, it used to be, when I was younger, that I believed, as many do, that excluded person was, for that period of time, without salvation, was in a state of damnation, and so on. Having studied the scriptures through, I'm not convinced of that any longer. But they are in a quarantine. Near where I used to live, there is a research facility called Fort Detrick. And in it is a very high secure research laboratory for level 4 diseases. And there happened to be a case where a person, quite by accident in her case, came in contact with a terrible disease. It was Ebola. And because of that, she had to be in quarantine in a airtight, air-supplied room for something like a week. Now, she was alive. She was still on the staff. She actually still collected her salary. But no one was allowed any contact with her. And I believe that that is the situation that we have in this so-called churching or disfellowship that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians and that Jesus talks about in Matthew. That the person is treated as an outsider to the church. That their behavior and their justification of their behavior will not be transmitted to others in the church who might be weak to that. So for this reason, if Paul had come, there would have been this whole issue of doing this. And there are people who were upset that it was done. There are people that wanted to go very hard. And we see later in 2 Corinthians, we'll get to it after some days, that it had had its appropriate effect. Someone had repented. And then there are people that didn't want to forgive. So all of this turmoil had been going on in the church. And Paul, through the Holy Spirit, had judged that it was best to let the church work through this on their own. Because if he had come, he would have had to exercise his apostolic authority very firmly. And as we find in the parable of the wheat and the tares, this can have the effect of uprooting the faith of some. And so to spare anyone, the church, from having any disturbance of the faith of the weak, he had delayed until the church, through the working of the Holy Spirit in the church, had to some degree resolved the problems that were going on. And that is basically the message of this verse.